Head of Philanthropy, and I'll speak more about Be the Earth in a minute, but I just want to welcome everyone. Thank you for your presence, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the speakers. They're amazing, all powerful women. Love when women unite to share their knowledge. And also just remembering a few Zoom practices. If you want to speak, you're welcome to raise your hand. We love people with their cameras on so we can feel we are speaking to humans, but we understand if that's not possible, that's okay as well. We like also inviting some people to be the heart keepers, which mean capturing the beauties in between the lines of what's said or insights, and also not only the beauties, but whatever you think it's relevant to be shared. So if you want to be a heart keeper, you're welcome to share your highlights with us later by the end of the session. So I'll start introducing Be the Earth, and then I'll hand over for Faith to introduce Regenerosity. We're partnering here once again. It's a pleasure to be hosting all these learning experiences with you. So Be the Earth is a very young family foundation, which is actually a hybrid organization because we do both impact investing and philanthropy, operating under the same vision of a world that nurtures all beings. And both in impact investing and philanthropy, we love building deep reciprocal relationships, not just transactional. We like to offer support that goes beyond the capital, and also like to receive that back in reciprocity in a way that the whole network has access to more knowledge and learning and partnerships and collaboration. I'm head of philanthropy, and we're very trust-based focused. So all of our programs, all of our grants are as debureaucratized as we are able to do so far, all unrestricted grants. And yeah, we mainly operate in Brazil, South Africa, and England. And you can check our website as well. There are a few videos, few blog posts that you can learn more about our programs, or reach out directly to me to learn more. I'll be happy to share with you.
Thanks, Renata. Just going to spotlight myself. So I am Faith Flanagan. I'm the 360 program lead for Regenerosity, which is a collaboration between Lush Spring Prize, the Buckminster Fuller Institute, Realliance, and the UNDP Equator Prize. And we have worked over the last 3+ years to leverage a track record of over 15 years of our shared experience of running prize programs and awarding over 400 projects. So over the past 2 years, we've given to 12 different projects over 3 different regions based on different aspects of community-led regenerative agriculture. And the regions include East Africa, India, and the Amazon. And we've facilitated these peer learning groups so that our cohorts and our organizations and project leads can learn from each other. So we believe that sharing stories from grassroots organizations and movements help to promote regenerative agriculture. We're working on a media series that we're promoting regenerative agriculture, and we're currently fundraising to finish the film, which is called Liberation Agriculture. And this is in partnership with The Growing Culture. And this film series really is about promoting diverse, just, and inclusive narrative around regenerative farming. So like many of you here, we are interested in promoting practices of trust-based philanthropy. And we've created opportunities for funders to take part in more radical funding practices. And we host webinars like this one. We Also have a flow fund, which is run by Indigenous women for Indigenous women in Brazil. And we run, as I said, a community of practice, which is in collaboration with Be the Earth and some other organizations that are also on this call. Thank you for being here. And the community of practice is really around how do we deeply act around trust-based philanthropy together in collaboration. So we run 3 working groups on a monthly basis. One of them is operating trust-based philanthropy around the due diligence and risks. The other one is inspiring practices, so case stories and studies around how people are practicing trust-based philanthropy. And the third working group is around collaborative capacity building. So as I said, we host these working groups on a monthly basis. We come together on a quarterly basis as a larger group. If you're interested in taking part in this community of practice, I can put a link into the chat. And it's you know, you can give as much as you like or as little as you like. We're also hosting, actually, Renata, if you want to speak about the in-person gathering in the UK that we're hosting in October, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so as part of the community of practice, we're hosting these webinars and other formats of having conversations between funders and grantees, which are called case clinics as well. And another element of this learning journey is the residential gathering. So we're going to meet in October with other peer funders to discuss the triad of philanthropy, impact investing, and taxes, which is another very exciting and complex realm to discuss for another webinar, hopefully. So thanks so much, Faith. James?
Thank you so much, Renata and Faith. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all. And like Renata said, we have an amazing panel of guests to discuss tonight's topic. So a huge thank you to our fantastic panel for being here and our wonderful guests. So thank you so much for joining us. We're here today to speak about activism and movements and funding activism and movements. And let me just tell you a little bit about how this session will run. Firstly, we'll have about half an hour now to speak with our wonderful panel guests who I'll introduce in a moment. And I invite everyone here, if you hear something that you find especially inspiring or something that you think is an interesting question that you'd like to dive more into, please feel free to pop it in this Jamboard that I've just popped into the chat box. So we'd love to collect some really interesting insights and questions in the Jamboard, which we will use to wrap up at the end of this session. So we'll be relying on you all here, our wonderful guests, to collect some of the insights that you hear from our wonderful panel guests. So let me tell you who we are very honored to have here today. So we have Farhana Yamin from the Climate Justice and Just Transition Donor Collaborative, who we'll speak with in just a moment. Thank you so much for being here, Farhana. We'll also speak with Christina Johansson from the Solberger Foundation and Olga Blumen from Tripod. So thank you both for being here as well too. And then we'll speak with Erica Edwards from Lush Cosmetics and Shannon Biggs and Casey Camp Horonek from Movement Rights. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I look forward to speaking with you in a moment as well too. But just to give everyone a bit of insight as to what we're discussing here today, we're here discussing funding activism, like we mentioned. And this might seem like an unusual subject to some, because in conventional philanthropy, funding activism and movements is relatively rare, I must say. Like, I'm calling in from the UK and from originally so-called Australia, from Mianjin in so-called Australia. By the way, I should introduce myself. My name is James. I work with Faith on the Regenerosity team and also help to coordinate the Lush Spring Prize. So like Erica Edwards, I also work with Lush Cosmetics. and Be the Earth and Hanata are partners for a special Ancient and Indigenous Wisdom Award in this year's Lush Spring Prize. But it's relatively unusual to fund activism. And why? Because, well, we're going to dive into some of that, but I feel because some of this work seems to be quite risky to some funders. A lot of funders tend to support things that might be perceived as, maybe I would use the word safe. As an example, here in the UK, a big percentage of funding goes to things which of course seem very important, like medical work, for example. A lot of funds channel into the medical sector, very important work, and yet it doesn't necessarily challenge it doesn't challenge the status quo. So why is it so challenging for funders to fund work that seems maybe a bit more radical? For example, what pops to mind for me is climate activism or other direct action work.
Hey.
So we're going to dive into some of these questions today with our wonderful panel guests. We have with us some fantastic radical funders who do fund in these sectors. So I'd love to ask you all how and why you got into funding in these sectors. We also have people here representing activists and land defenders, and we're really excited to hear about your perspective of receiving funding and working with funders as well too, and what you might say to philanthropists and funders as to why it's important to fund this kind of work. So I would love to welcome, first of all, Farhana Yamin. So welcome, Farhana. Farhana is the coordinator of the Climate Justice and Just Transition Donor Collaborative. Farhana is a lawyer, an author, a climate activist, and you have fantastic experience in advising and joining climate negotiations as well. So it's such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here and with such amazing panelists that you're convening, and also this amazing cascade of bios and people, you know, sharing their experience already. So thank you for doing that. So I have many hats, but I chose last year to go back into philanthropy because I wanted philanthropy to fund movements. So this is the rationale for me joining the Climate Justice and Just Transition Donor Collaborative, was absolutely part of why we're here to discuss why philanthropy doesn't do that more. And I guess the immediate experience and impetus had been that I'd been very active in Extinction Rebellion as a movement in the UK from 2018 and 2019. And I'd seen that there was an outpouring of energy and people who wanted to do more and who were asking and making very challenging demands of politicians and of other NGOs, of think tanks, of philanthropy, and they were really not getting funding. In the end, I have to say, one of the old philanthropies that I worked with, which was probably the antithesis, they would hate me to say that now, they've learned a lot, so this is a positive thing that I'm sort of saying, was the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. It's public, that they in the end funded this movement, which was very risky, which was undertaking direct, you know, it was rejecting the political system. And so that in itself is a big barrier, because many donors work in a charitable setting where political activities are certainly not allowed under a charitable framework or are circumscribed, and that environment has become more and more sort of hostile. And I think that, you know, trying just overtly saying we're out to change the entire system is way too scary for funders and way too considered naive. So it's like, well, why don't you just break that down into a few steps and show us what could you do in terms of changing the system over the next 6 months or 12 months, and then we'll see how it goes. Whereas non-linear change doesn't work like that. And I think that these are some of the really hidden, big, deep assumptions in most philanthropies that we make. And I think they also don't allow much for those with no track record So if you haven't got a track record, no one's going to trust you very much and give you money. So that's the reason that I've come into this, and I'm hoping that with the kind of changes that many of you are pioneering in your own philanthropy, including trust-based philanthropy, more participatory grant making, core funding activism directly. And again, one of the most important and wonderful innovations that XR made actually is they had a voluntary living expenses allowance system. So people were allowed to claim. There was no limit, but in fact, nobody really claimed that much. They certainly didn't even claim even the minimum wage equivalent. Most people asked for rent and a very basic allowance, and that funded the core of the activists. And at one time, I think there was a few hundred people, but I sort of figured and did some calculations that in fact, I mean, that was the most cost-effective grant that CIF ever made, in terms of the change and in terms of the way in which, climate was then back on the agenda. And today I'm just going to finish. I've just come back from another, it's called the Net Zero Festival, where everyone in that room, which is over 600 CEOs, CFOs, CSOs, chief sustainability officers, mainly from the corporate world, are celebrating actually net zero and actually attribute that directly to the activism of young people, of students, the Sunrise Movement, XR, all over. They know that that's where the push came from and that's where the change came from. But before all that happened, it would have been very hard to find anyone to really back these, and all of that work was done on a shoestring or on no budgets at all. And that's what we have to change. I think that whole system.
I mean, that's an amazing testament to show that campaigning works. I love that story. And what you described, Farhana, around basically giving money directly to activists for them to do this important work. I mean, that's fantastic. And it's also quite a radical way of funding, I think. From your experience of working with this perhaps more conventional funder or seeing that experience of them funding XR, what do you think were some of those pathways for them to, moving into the more radical end of the funding spectrum, do you think?
Well, I wish they would, I wish the people within CIF could tell their side of the story. I think some of it was recognizing that we were stuck and that we had to try new things and we needed a more radical flank. And at the time in 2018, we'd negotiated Paris. We were still stuck with a minus 80% target in the UK, which was one of the leading countries that, said that they were progressive. So I think it was that sense that we need a radical flank. We don't have one. Everyone's sort of congregated and stuck in the middle, and no one's really challenging the political system. There wasn't enough pointy, sharp accountability even. And I think that the sort of campaigning styles were a bit stale and relying on, very much of a sort of almost like a revolving door of people who were negotiators, then went to the NGO, then came back, or, relying on essentially a handful of think tanks who, thought that they were doing great campaigning work, but it had very, very shallow roots, and there was no mass mobilization involved in that. There was, some iconic actions, but not enough direct action by anyone. People weren't engaged on a personal level. I think also there was a sort of recognition that we'd all been a bit nerdy and policy wonky, and that we had trusted the system. We had thought, and I blame myself, and I'm part of that generation, but carbon taxes and permits, that we would get them right. We would get the carbon price right, and we would make changes through the market and through technology forcing that would result. And basically by that time in 2018, 2019, it was obvious that that wasn't really going to happen without some major push. And in fact, very weak markets or no markets or very weak carbon prices were the result. So I think it was a recognition that the existing strategies hadn't really worked and weren't really delivering. What else could we try? It was kind of a desperation sort of thing as well. And then I think the final thing is a whole I guess of insights from the world of psychology and neuroscience, from comms experts, saying that we hadn't really touched hearts at all. All of this was very cerebral. All of this was very much appealing to a cost benefit analysis, and the economy will be much better, instead of asking where people were in that economy already, instead of looking at the existing inequalities, all the existing problems, and trying to say, oh well, somehow going green would solve everything through these mechanisms. So I think we left people behind, we left hearts and minds behind, and again, that's why some of these new movements, as it were, used much more emotional language, used more emotional, used theatre, used art, used creativity much more, and were more successful as a result.
Thank you for that. I think that's really powerful to advise, mixing the heart with the facts as well too. And I think that's a really lovely approach. Thank you so much for this. And Farhana, I'd love to come back and discuss more as a whole panel. And just to let everyone know, after our panel discussion, everyone will be invited into an activity that we call a fishbowl activity. And Farhana, I'd love to invite you to be part of that as well too, where people can ask questions and we can continue this conversation a bit later on. So thank you so much for joining us. I would absolutely love to welcome Christina and Olga now. So Christina Johansson is the director of the Solberger Foundation, a family foundation that supports transformative grassroots movements for climate justice. And Olga Blumen, the co-director of Tripod, a worker-owned cooperative working with grassroots collectives and campaigning organizations to support with training, facilitation, and system building. Welcome, Christina and Olga. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both. So Christina and Olga, you have an existing relationship through funding, is that right? Can you tell us a bit about that?
I guess officially, Tripod is a grantee of the Solberger Foundation. So that's where our relationship started.
Excellent. And Christina, I'd love to ask you about your history with funding in the climate activist and grassroots movements. How did you come into this? How did this become part of Solberger's mission?
Yeah, I mean, we heard a little bit from Farhana, but I mean, grassroots movements and they've been central to every kind of major social and economic transformation in world history. So when we set up our foundation 4 years ago, we made sure that we wanted to support activists and social movements because they're absolutely essential to transforming the kind of landscape of political power and will. And in the case of the climate crisis, where we focus, it is communities of color, low-income communities, indigenous people that are most intimately familiar with the crisis, and also the ones who are pointing to the direction of solutions. And as Farhana said, these groups are often, on shoestring budgets, but they're having this outsized impact. And it's these activists and movement folks who are fundamentally changing the debate about and holding leaders accountable. And I think philanthropy, as when we entered philanthropy, we were trying to figure out what role should we be playing in this strange world of philanthropy. We saw that there's a real gap in funders playing a critical role in empowering and resourcing activists and grassroots leadership, and really building power from below as a strategy. And I think one of the issues is that social transformation doesn't happen overnight, and philanthropy is very addicted to results. And I think we're uniquely positioned as philanthropists to actually take risks and to be flexible in how we fund this kind of transformative root cause work.
Fantastic. Thank you, Christina. And I'd love to ask you more about how we might be able to influence funders in funding this more transformational work that is challenging to measure. But first, I'd love to ask Olga to tell us a bit about Tripod and your work, because it sounds like not only you kind of work in the activism space, but also you work with activists. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So yeah, Tripod is a collective made up of kind of trainers and facilitators, and all of us have our own backgrounds in social movements. So I've been very involved in climate justice and food justice movements over time. And so we are kind of a movement infrastructure organization. So yeah, I was thinking about how best to kind of explain that. And I think maybe like a kind of ecology metaphor of Farhana already spoke about kind of shallow roots. And what Tribal really does is like the kind of underground, like kind of connecting and resourcing and feeding of the movement ecosystems that we support. So yeah, so we support movements and groups tackling the root causes of injustice. We prioritize people who campaign on the issues that directly affect them. And we do that in lots of different ways. But mainly it's about kind of building relationships that last and that can, over the longer term, make change happen. So we bring people together across groups and across movements. We create spaces for learning, for skill sharing. We train up people in different campaigning skills, but also collaborative skills and how to work together for the long haul in a sustainable way within groups and within movements. So that's kind of our work. We're more like backbone support, and we're often invisible. But I think as other organizations like us, that maybe the organizations that offer legal support to movements or materials to movements in terms of infrastructure or other training and education collectives, this work is really vital for movements to be more effective and more powerful, and to keep building the power we really need in this time from the ground up.
Fantastic. And when you're speaking, what's coming up for me is how important this must be in social movements and within activism. And also, I mean, Faith and Renata have already spoken about trust-based philanthropy today. And I think one of the ideas of this is how can we build relationships between grantees and funders as well too, built on trust. And it sounds like you might have some insight from working in this space and building trust in social movements. Would you have any advice for people building relationships between funders, and how might this be effective and true and strong?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other speakers and Christina also already mentioned the importance of starting from trust and the ability, like the willingness to take risk, and I guess risk in it's I was feeling also a bit uncomfortable about that word, because we're living in a time where lots of people are at risk because of the system, and more people will be at risk. So of course there's always a risk to lose money, but what is that risk in the bigger picture of what is needed right now? So in terms of relationships, I think it's a lot about movement-centered funding, and the decisions being made with the leadership of people embedded in movements, because I think the trust building starts from the moment that decisions are being made about where wealth is distributed, and then it's about unrestricted funding, core funding, so that groups and movements that know what is needed can be flexible and be able to respond to an ever shifting kind of context. And I think it's also about like supporting groups to share their learning, not just their impact, and acknowledge that a lot of this kind of systemic change is the long haul. So of course we can do projects and of course we want to have impact, but also trusting in the kind of slow work of movement building and building grassroots power that may need many years to or many generations even to show the results we want to see. So I guess there's also that kind of trust in movements and the slow work of movements, I suppose.
Oh, thank you for that. And on that, I think that's a really powerful point. And on that, I'd love to ask you, Christina, for this long-term work and for this work that is quite systemic and can be complex and can be kind of hard to see instant kind of gratification or instant impact of. What advice would you give to other funders on how we might measure that? And like you were saying earlier, if impact isn't instantly visible, what do we do in situations like that?
Yeah, I think I just want to add something on the risk piece, because I think it is a really important term that often gets thrown around, and funders are careful about taking risk, but the risk is really different than the risk that movements and frontline leaders are taking. And there was a quote from a woman who leads the freedom organization in New Orleans, who said at a funders conference that people who work in the movements have little and give everything they have materially, emotionally, collectively, and that she challenges funders to try to match what they give in the movements with our funding. And I think that, that goes beyond, I think we're going to chat about that a little bit more, but it goes beyond just, giving grants. It's how we give grants, giving them in ways that Olga has mentioned around, incorporating more trust-based practices of grants, but it's also how else can we show up in solidarity in authentic partnerships with movements? And I think a lot of these questions, especially this one around measurement, there isn't one answer, and a lot of it is also reframing how we think about philanthropy, and how it's very sticky and messy stuff. And I think, having been in this space for a while, I've learned that really movements are they're committed to this, as we just said, this work. And so listening to them in terms of how to measure the impact, in listening to how they're being responsive and learning and iterating, and how they're measuring their own impact is much more in alignment with the kind of transformation we need than the kind of reporting processes that we currently have, that funders are so that the expectation is currently for traditional philanthropy. But I think that there's a multiplicity of ways that we need to be challenging how we do evaluation, and there's some amazing folks exploring kind of social justice evaluation, movement evaluation, and it's much more it's much more ecosystem like looking than it is direct results that you can measure in numbers. It's more narrative. But I think it's having a more holistic understanding of how movements shift society.
Yeah, thank you for this. And I think there's so much power, like you say, in listening and being adaptable around what we're hearing from our partners, from people who are doing the work on the ground. And yeah, allowing space for storytelling, like you say, sharing in narrative format rather than instant kind of numerical measurements, maybe. So thank you so much, Olga and Christina. It's been a pleasure to chat, and I hope we can chat more in the fishbowl activity. So thank you so much for this. And thank you both. And I would love to welcome Erica, Shannon, and Casey. Thank you all so much for being here. Casey Camp-Horanek is an elder and environmental ambassador for the Ponca Nation of Oklahoma and part of the Movement Rights Board. Casey leads the Ponca Rights of Nature program and co-leads the Intertribal Rights of Nature Forum. Shannon Biggs is co-founder of Movement Rights, and since 2014, Movement Rights has worked with tribes and indigenous communities across Turtle Island and communities of color to align human laws with the laws of the natural world. And Erica Edwards is the Global Charitable Giving Manager at Lush Cosmetics, where Erica oversees Lush's multi-million-dollar giving program, Charity Pot. Thank you so much, Erica, Shannon, Casey. It's a pleasure to be here with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And so, Erica, Casey, Shannon, you've connected through the Charity Pot program before, is that right?
Yes. In fact, when we started Movement Rights, we started it with on credit cards, and Lush, Charity Pot, and Erica Edwards specifically were our very first grantor. And in the world of philanthropy, that means everything, because so many funders won't fund you, and they want to know who else funds you. They want to know, and you have to have this, track record. So we started our track record on credit cards, and Lush really opened the door to all of the funding that our small organization has received. So in terms of true partnership and the spirit of trust-based philanthropy, I can honestly say that our work wouldn't be possible without that kind of a relationship. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Shannon. It's fantastic to hear that. And also troubling that you had to start your work on credit cards as well, from that perspective. But wonderful.
You're not supposed to say that. You're not supposed to say that, but yes.
Yeah, but thank you so much for sharing this. I'd love to ask Casey and Shannon, could you tell us a bit about Movement Rights and what you do?
Sure. Well, I'm going to happily turn it over to Casey in just a second, because we are a women, and we are an Indigenous and women-led organization. We make decisions as basically the three of us: Casey Camp Hornick, Penny Opal Plant, and myself. We're it's that kitchen table sort of activism, and as Christina said, that creates that sort of outsized impact. We work on the issues of the intersection really of climate justice, Indigenous rights, and rights of nature. And Casey is really at the heartbeat of all of that, and has been for many, many decades. So I'm happy to turn it over to Casey to share a little bit about not just the work we do, but the work that is, that we are part of this collective mosaic of climate justice activism, and why that's so important.
My name is Casey Camp Hornick. I'm a member of the Ponca Nation, an elder of the Ponca Nation in North Central Oklahoma. Hi, Erica, Shannon, and everyone else. It's so good to get to meet so many people. I've heard your names and love to hear your wisdom. As a member of a nation in Oklahoma, it's very difficult for me to just begin where we are right now without just a teensy bit of history. My people, as well as the majority of the tribes in Oklahoma, there are 39 here. We're all from different territories in what's called the United States. We refer to as Turtle Island. Our people were from the North Central Plains. And when my grandpa was 6, we were forcibly removed here on a trail of tears where 1 in 3 of us died. The area that we live in, as a result of that forced removal, and as a result of the mismanagement and frankly the misuse of the trust responsibility of the United States federal government in terms of this thing they called economic development, created a situation where my people not only were dispossessed of our original territories of over 200 million acres of land to this small postage stamp of land that we've been dispossessed of because we did not know the language, we did not know the deeds, we didn't understand what the Bureau of Indian Affairs, it's like being born with a legal authority belonging to someone else. So they signed these papers that provided what they called economic development, which left us in an area of environmental degradation to the point of genocide. And after 5 treaties, and after many elected officials in our territory, we're still dealing with the colonial aspects of the extractive industry killing us. You can't grow organic food within an 8-mile radius of ConocoPhillips 76 refinery, which is right where we live. The rivers have been killed. The forelegs, the fins, the ones that fly. And as a result, all of us are suffering from these cancers, from autoimmune diseases, from cardiovascular diseases. Our babies are being born with cancers. Our autism is off the scales. And all of these things have led us to being part of various movements. When I was young, the American Indian movement, some over 50 years ago, with no funding. The funding was spirit led people who would put on a pot of beans and feed us, you know, and tents put up in yards. But with the understanding that we had to stop the forced sterilization of our women in the IHS Indian Health Service, we did that. Change the educational system, change how the housing was looked at. All of these things have taken place because the Great Spirit and the Earth Mother, the Father Sky, have given us the opportunity and the knowledges to help go into a space of rebalance. As a result of working with people like Movement Rights, there has been, and thank you again, Erica, for helping us to make things like this come about. We have done a series of things here. First, when I was elected to council and understanding our sovereignty, we are on a government basis. So we began to pass some resolutions. The first one was to put a moratorium on fracking and injection wells to stop that kind of killing and the 10,000 earthquakes that were man-made and the fracking that was not only destroying the bones of the earth, but also robbing her of her lifeblood, the sacred water itself, and creating situations that were causing all of this death of all living beings in our territory. Then we also worked with the stopping of KXL by passing a tribal resolution and by using one of the 5 treaties that was made and abrogated by the federal government, but not abrogated on our end of things. So to hold them accountable, sacred corn was planted by my son up in Nevadaska, Nebraska, which created a sacred site, which was one of the many ways that the Alliance, the Cowboy and Indian Alliance, worked to stop KXL from coming through. My family, my sons were taking leadership in Standing Rock after that. These things that happen at home happen along the rivers because we understand that is the manner in which all of us will survive. And quickly, I want to say each and everything, these risk factors that you all are talking about, I do understand from the perspective of Western civilization education. But coming from an indigenous perspective, the risk itself is that we are going to be eliminated as a species, humans are, because of our behavior. And it is necessary for us to be able to understand that, in Standing Rock, we actually understood that it was not only spirit-led, but we called ourselves land defenders and water protectors, when in fact we are not defending nature. We are nature defending itself at this point. And we have to internalize and understand that before we can continue. So working with Movement Rights, with all of the support systems, through community education and through the will of the Ponca people. In 2017, we became the first tribe to put into a statute within our tribal law the immutable Ponca rights of nature, recognizing all of those things we just spoke about. And recently in July 6th, again, after community meetings and with the guidance of Wakanda and the water herself, we recognize the immutable rights of the rivers in our territory, becoming the first nation, the indigenous nation within the United States to do so. And by exerting sovereignty of the rivers themselves through the sovereignty of the Ponca Nation, we're going to be able to hold some of those people accountable for what they're doing. And that preserves the lives of the monarchs flying over us and the eagles who nest on the river, the fish that we depend on, the deer that feeds my family. And we could go on and on for a long time. Synopsis is there. And I want to say thank you to all of you, and understand, please, the deeper and greater risk is doing nothing.
Thank you so much for this, Casey. It's such an honor and a privilege to listen to you. And I completely resonate with what you say, that there might be these perceived risks from funders, but exactly like you say, I agree. The risk is doing nothing. The risk is extinction of our species and many other species. And congratulations on the fantastic achievements of rights for the river and all your wonderful achievements. And thank you so much for sharing. And Erica, I would love to ask you about your experience funding activism, because I know that the Charity Pot funds fantastic work like Casey and Shannon are doing with movement rights. But why? Why is this part of Lush's priority?
Yeah, thank you, James. And thank you, Casey, and thank you, Shannon, and all the rest of you have been sharing the work that you do. And I feel like when you're hearing these stories and the work of activists, it becomes so clear, like this is the way forward. This is where the funding should go. And if only other funders had the opportunity and took this space and what we call the risk, which for me is not a risk to be funding activists, then I think that the movement around traditional philanthropy would move that much quicker towards more trust-based and more looking at systemic change, looking at the root cause, so that we're not funding these other pieces as a reactive measure. So, at Lush, we have always been a campaigning company. So when we launched a Charity Pot, which is a vehicle for us to be able to fund small grassroots organizations, it only really made sense that we would be going to the streets, looking at, activists that have boots on the ground. It's the community-based organizations that are often feeling the effects. They know what they need. We need to listen, we need to understand, and we need to shift the power dynamic that currently exists in so much of our traditional philanthropy, and really look at partnership and reciprocity, and how do we give what organizations need to do the real work, right? So as a funder, for me, it's a very clear path to what needs to get done. And activists are those that start the movements, that gain the knowledge of what needs to get done at a very early stage. And it's just been incredible, to be honest with you, the learning that has happened over the last 15 years. We launched Charity Pot 15 years ago, so we're celebrating that this year, and have donated over 65 million pounds to small grassroots organizations. And I can't imagine it, doing it any other way, quite honestly. It's going beyond the check, and not just giving, the dollars, but looking at how can we use our platforms as funders, in this specific instance at Lush, we have a platform to be able to provide and uplift voices of activists and the groups that we're supporting, whether that's through stores, whether that's through communications, and even just making connections to other funders to be able to continue the work beyond just the one grant, or several grants that we're giving, and looking at that, continued support. So, and I really appreciate what Christina was talking about in terms of looking at the impact and the measurements, and really like, okay, looking at, a lot of funders will say you need to have the maximum amount of impact hitting the maximum amount of people. Whereas, it's like, well, what is actually coming out when you have a smaller amount of people, and that's growing, but to be able to fund at the smaller stage to provide that stepping stone, and looking at, what's the overall effect. And again, we've, heard today about that that long term, and it doesn't always happen really quickly. And so maybe, you know, we need to be looking at the storytelling, listening, what do grantees want to tell funders about the work, rather than please provide, you know, an output of this, and this, because we need to be doing specific reporting out. So yeah, I mean, just listening to all of you here today, it's really encouraging that there's this conversation happening in this webinar today. So thank you for that. But yeah, it's for funders that have never really ventured into funding activists, you know, it's a leap of faith for them, you know, to take a step, dip your toes in the water, do a little bit. You might not have to go all in, but you'll quickly realize by funding a couple the difference in what that is in terms of the movement and what you're deciding that you're going to fund. So
Thank you so much for this, Erica. And like you said, I really hope we can convince more people to, like you say, dip your toes in. And in a moment, we're going to move across to another activity where I hope that we can continue the discussion. But Shannon, would you like to say a final word before we move on?
Yes, I just wanted to quickly say, and I know we have a huge packed agenda, but when in 2008, I was looking at funding of activism, and it was less than 2% of all funding. And trust-based philanthropy has really begun to open the door, because it allows for the more radical solutions, including rights of nature, which I don't actually think is radical, but we can't protect nature as long as we treat it as property, but it's the basis of law and culture everywhere, politically speaking. And there's, and now it is the fastest growing environmental movement in the world. Globally, it is led by Indigenous people. Most of those are not being paid. It is part of their spiritual and their responsibility to the earth to do this work. And when we look at things like what stops pipelines or who stops pipelines, it's not the UN COP process. It's certainly not President Biden. It's not the regulatory agencies. It's usually always Indigenous, Black, people of color putting their bodies on the line to protect upstream and downstream for everyone. They're not getting paid to do this work. And, you know, in the end result is that a lot of the funding then goes to sort of the big green groups to fund climate work, which is very different from climate justice work. These radical, you know, solutions are the things that are actually creating the change. If, you know, fossil fuel states in the United States have banned protesting of fossil fuel facilities for a reason, because it's effective. And large green organizations, which sometimes re-grant or shine a spotlight to Indigenous and frontline climate justice groups, that in a way that doesn't always feel good to the Indigenous people, to the frontline community people, that leads to, you know, sort of a disparity, a tokenization, when they're the ones who are actually doing the work. And so I know I may be overstepping my time and everything here, but I feel like that is such an important message, and that this group of people and this trust-based philanthropy that are really putting the money where the people on the ground who are creating these solutions, who are risking their lives and to change the world and to change and to preserve life on Mother Earth. That is climate justice work. That is where the innovation and solutions come from. So I just wanted to say, for those of you who are funding in that space, we're so grateful for all of that, because it's getting harder and harder. And we need to bring more and more people with us. But it has to be led by the people on the ground who are on the front lines of climate justice. It has to be not led by the big greens, but by Indigenous people, by BIPOC, LGBT communities. That's where the leadership is, and that's where the funding needs to go. And I really thank you for letting me overshare. I appreciate it.
No, thank you. Not an oversharing at all, but a really important point to draw this part of the webinar to a close. So thank you so much, Shannon, for pointing this out. I'm very, very grateful for this. And I think, like Farhana said before, mixing the heart with the facts. And I think we've done that very much on this panel. So thank you all so much for this. Erica, Shannon, Casey, it's been a pleasure to talk. And I really hope that we can continue the discussion in the next section too. So thank you all so much. I'm very grateful. I'd like to welcome Renata to talk about how we will facilitate the next part of the session. And we'll need to do some technical bits. So Renata, would you like to tell us how we might facilitate this next bit?
Yes, thank you. But before that, can I just invite us all to take a deep breath in, just to like embody everything that was shared. That was so powerful. I have goosebumps all over my body. So just very quickly. Thank you. Feels so hopeful being in a circle like that, listening to these voices. Feels like we're heading on the right direction, and for a moment doesn't feel like everything is on the edge of collapse, but it is and it isn't, because there's so much good work happening as well. So thanks everyone that spoke, but also who's present here doing amazing work. So do you mind, we're going to do what we call a fishbowl. So it's an interactive way just to bring a bit of movement to these squares on your screen, but also not a breakout room. So basically, if either James or Faith can share the screen, that will help you, guide you. It's really easy. Basically, you're gonna click on the arrow close to your video. And then you're gonna click on the video settings as it shows there on the slide. And then you're gonna scroll down, if in case you don't see this tick box called hide non-video participants. So you tick that box and you're ready to go. So I'll invite everyone that is not a panelist to close their videos now. I'm going to do that in a moment. So the idea is that we have people that have their videos on the spotlight, and I'm going to do just a few guiding questions because they're great questions on the Jamboard. I really recommend you take a look at that, and also just let the conversation flow for a bit. I'm going to run over a bit on my time because it's just too much exciting things to talk about. So we're going to do that until 25 past the hour. So we are going to start with the panelists, but the idea is that once you conclude, like when you close whatever you wanted to share, you close your video, and then that gives space to anyone in the audience to join, funder, grantee, academic person, research, just someone interested. Whoever you are, you're welcome to join here and share your thoughts and ask questions as well. Okay, so please, panelists, would you like to start? We are 6 people. I'm not sure if we can do 6 people. I'm going to take my video off, but you're going to keep hearing my voice. I just need to get out of the spotlight. And oh, why is this not? Is it just me? Wait a minute.
You also might need to change to gallery view in the top right hand corner.
That helps.
But yeah, and for everyone as well too, if you can only see one person, switch to gallery view.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. So we have some guiding questions, some directed to funders, some directed to activists, but I also am aware that there are also funders that are activists and activists that are funders and all those combinations. So I'll start with kind of like a collective questions and feel free to just start answering whoever's ready. So do you see any gaps or opportunities that are currently not being looked at in terms of how we fund and why we fund? Any low-hanging fruits or an easy point of entry for funders that would like to fund more movements? Like if someone, let's rephrase it, if someone is willing to start doing that, what would you recommend? Farhana?
Well, there's just a huge need to fund activism and movements, and especially to support grassroots and local NGOs that, as well as, movements. And so one of the things we're doing is a mapping and a landscaping exercise called the Compendium, where we're trying to collect as many names and organizations and put them, at the moment, a massive Excel sheet, so that we can all see each other. And it's always going to be incomplete. It's a crazy sort of project, but we need to know and find each other and help each other, and who are working in philanthropy find these organizations and people who are out there doing brilliant work. I think in terms of gaps, the biggest gap, I think, and I'm putting it as a proposition, is youth funding in particular. There's virtually no real funds for youth. Specifically, there are now funds, not enough of them. I'm not saying we should forget the bigger needs of everyone, for Indigenous people, for women, for others, but there isn't really a specific set of mechanisms for youth, and that's a sort of real problem. And that's one of the things that we were discussing last week in Climate Week. What does that look like? And the need is really critical, because I think our youth are doing much more weaving of our own movements. We were very sort of siloed and had come to specialize quite a lot. So actually they're taking a much more intersectional, much more connecting, and a much more a different approach. So my energy is on that front, and we don't want them also to tire out and get burnt out, in their teens and 20s, in the way many of us did. So I feel, especially as a sort of elder in this movement, that I want to make sure that no one has to go through such horrible experiences where they feel diminished as well as unsupported, and that has to change. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll invite one more voice to this question, and then we see where we get. So if you would advise someone that wants to start funding activism and movement, what do you think would be a low-hanging fruit or an easy first step? You're unmuted, but I can't hear you. I don't know if anyone else can.
Me?
No, Olga. She started.
Okay. Sorry.
No, that's so weird. Maybe you're supposed to answer another question then. Anyone else wants to jump in?
Renata, I would just say and echo what Shannon said is funding Indigenous movement. It's very clear, and there is such a need. The percentage of organizations and funders that are supporting grassroots Indigenous communities directly is disproportionate to what we should be in terms of the environment, human rights, animal protection. It is imperative, and I'm not sure if there's necessarily some low-hanging fruit or if there's an easy way to do it. I think you just need to start doing it, and trusting, and also connecting with other folks that have those relationships and that have done it, to see that that it's not scary, and it shouldn't be. It's just what needs to get done. So I think that's a massive void. And of course, LGBTQ led, women led, youth led. We need to be shifting that dynamic and providing those voices.
Thank you. So connected to these statements of like the unprivileged or minority groups that are really underfunded, what else do you think, especially for the activists and fundees here in the circle, what else do you think is one of the hardest things to fundraise for, that you think is really essential to get your work done?
I'm gonna do another try. Is my sound back? Great. Yeah, I think somehow my mic turned off. Yeah, I think quite a lot of things so much needs funding. I think definitely the movement infrastructure organizations that I mentioned before, those organizations that are like Tribal, that are kind of underground, invisible, but offering resources and capacities and skills for social movements to keep going. So yeah, organizations like Netpol, the Scottish Communities and Activists Legal Project, Scampi, the Scottish Communities Materials and Infrastructure Project, all of education and physical spaces, all of those infrastructure organizations that support movements. I also think that we need funders to focus on accessibility, both the work required to make our organizations more accessible and inclusive to people with different needs and responsibilities, carrying responsibilities. So that does require resourcing, and also to make our events and organizing more accessible, and for specific funding to be dedicated to that. Definitely youth, Farhana, and also other direct action and mass civil disobedience movements and groups, and that are doing that's frontline work. And well-being support, I think, as well, like making it just a requirement for every organization that you fund to have a budget line that goes towards giving people rest, giving people the support they need at different moments in the year, in the work they do. It just supporting different ways of working, I suppose, that are more sustainable and accessible and collaborative. I think is really, really key.
Amazing. Yeah, well-being is definitely a great one and not very spoken about. Shannon and Casey, do you want to add anything? And then I'll do one question directed to the funders, and I'll invite whoever wants to turn off their camera, and then also give space for the audience. But first I want to hear Shannon and or Casey.
Shannon, if you don't mind. And thank you, everyone. I'm loving to listen. I don't hear any one bad suggestion. I think, again, youth are very, very valuable. When we had our meeting here, our convening of the Four Winds, which Lush actually attended in person, I really was grateful to be among them. Carlene was here, and she was frontline, standing in the rain with us in front of the building, and that meant a lot to us, to see not only are they funding us and helping us in movement rights, but showing up and putting their bodies on the line as well. I think that for us at our home, and I can only speak from here, I do work with the Global Alliance on the Rights of Nature, Indigenous Council as well, that there is not one area that we don't need help. We need help being able to arrive at direct actions. We need help being able to put on our iron forums, our intertribal rights of nature forums. Many of the young people that came to our gathering came on a shoestring and slept in their cars when they arrived here because they didn't have hotel money. ate what their family had packed for them in a lunch. And that's often the case. And yet they're the front lines folks all the time. One of the young men was one of those in Standing Rock who'd been shot in the eye and was blinded. And yet he was still here, still raising his voice, still standing on the front lines. You know, here in our home, we're trying to start another form of food and lodging altogether that is bringing back the old earthen lodge buildings that are sustainable with climate change, that they are going to be able to withstand the tornadoes, that we can put our sacred herbs and butterfly and bee habitats on top of them as we grow them. Those are, how do you get funding for those if you're not a 501c3? That's another thing that happens with our folks. You know, we help each other. We help each other through funerals, through our giveaways. We help each other in terms of domestic violence situations. And we started the MMIW things from nothing, and we're missing and murdered Indigenous women in response to what happens with the extractive industries, man camps in our territories. Bringing in these drugs right now. Methamphetamine is a big issue that we deal with here. Those are within our home. We don't have the time for the downtime that is so often spoken about within these larger NGOs and others, where you need rest and you need to be able to pull back and regroup and have some healing. We're still dealing with the intergenerational trauma of hundreds of years of colonization. And none of us, not you, not me, not anybody, has the time to take that rest right now. I understand the need to regenerate, but we have to find those circles within our own structures that give us the energy to continue. It's critical right now that none of us step back and all of us step forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. So some of what Casey said was on my mind as well. When you're on the front lines and you're shot in the face, you're bitten by dogs, you're, you know, the corporate, machinery comes and in the middle of winter sprays freezing cold water on people in the middle of the night, and sends off you know, percussion grenades and all of these things, and marks you with a number on your skin, as Casey and her children have been done after being maced and put into dog cages. This is part of, this is part of what it takes to move the needle to justice, and the ability to, as Casey said, the, you know, regeneration, what happens after those things occur is often that you're asked to retell those stories of trauma on stages, and you know, some of the larger organizations will fund you to come speak at their events and rip your heart open to share these stories of missing and murdered Indigenous women, sisters, and then you go home. And I don't know what the right answer is, but a couple of things happen. One, some funding for legal support for when we do come and face those, you know, those machines, and we're, you know, put in jail and called a felon, and then can no longer, you know, can't pay the fines. That does dampen down what is what is possible, because Indigenous people are riding in their cars and living in their cars to be able to do the work to protect the earth. So how do we begin to at least pay their legal fees for doing that on our behalf, and how to get other people to join them, but while recognizing their leadership and not taking over in those spaces, is an important piece. And generally speaking, just being able to fund time for regeneration. There is a need for that. So when you're talking about an unpaid group of people on the front lines who are protecting their communities, and everyone else who are not really getting paid, some not paid at all, how do they recover from that trauma? How do they regenerate, and how can we ask them to be there for us time and time again? And so those pieces of the work, I don't know that I have the right answer, but it's something that's circling around in all of the climate justice activists, is how do we protect our relatives who are standing for us in those spaces? And without funding, nobody's funding vacations for people or a retreat for people, or even strategy sessions for just frontline community folks to come together to develop their own solutions. And a lot of funders, oh, we don't fund events. They're not events. They're, this is a strategic gathering of frontline leaders who need to be able to come together, and who can't. So those are some of the things that can begin, that can be done to begin to sort of re-examine what it means to have a gathering of leaders of movements to come together to strategize, and also at the end of an event to have a space even to just air out and let some of the emotions flow, because we get arrested, we do the work, and then we go back home, and there isn't even a time for a collective embrace of each other and recognition of the sacrifice that people on the front lines are putting through. So thank you
so much. I hope funders on this call are taking notes. We have a big, amazing list of things that really lack funding, and maybe connecting to the first question is a way to start, which doesn't mean it's easy or obvious, but really encourage that. And so now we don't have much longer for this conversation, unfortunately, but I'll invite some of you to turn off your cameras, but I want to actually invite mainly Christina and Erica to stay, and also anyone else that wants to join this, because I see how we've been talking about how much the activists do and the front line, and how important their work are, and how that moves the needle. But I also truly believe that the funders are in a position to move the needle as well in another level, because we're talking about systems, and we have laws, and we have practice and influences and board positions in corporations, and so on and so on. So my question is, what is the role of the funders in all this, and how can we use our space of privilege and our space for having our voice heard to also help moving the needle? And please, anyone from the audience, if you want to put on your camera and join, you're more than welcome.
Yeah, I'm happy to try to tackle that. I think the philanthropic sector. Sorry, it's a little feedback. But yeah, the philanthropic sector has a ton of power and is doing things in ways that many of us here are calling out. And I think there is a real role and responsibility for funders to be working alongside activists and movement leaders to be influencing and trying to like engage in transforming the philanthropic sector and having the conversations we're having here now. I think when it comes to movements, there's like still a pretty big fundamental gap with funders actually understanding what movements are. It's something I've noticed, like when I'm trying to talk to funders about funding activism, they really have like this one image of what it looks like and how difficult, whether that's legal restrictions or whatever, as why they can't do it. Or because maybe it is because it's calling out the kind of root cause or systems change that is a bit scary and their boards might not be down for. But I think, you know, one way to be engaging funders around this is to, you know, do more education and more understanding about the kind of like ecosystem of movements and understanding the kind of multiplicity of ways that it looks like to fund in ecosystem movements, because I think we don't see all of the parts. And Olga and others have been mentioning that there's like a number of ways that you can engage with funding movements if you're maybe not a movement funder, and it might be difficult to bridge that with your board, who at least in the UK, most boards, when the Association of Charitable Foundations did research on who sits on boards, there were 99% white, 70% over the age of 65. 70% men, and like majority over the age of 65. So you know who is sitting on the boards. And so recognizing that those people often don't have lived experiences, aren't engaged in movements, probably don't really understand what a movement is. So we have some serious work around shifting who's sitting on boards, which is around power shifting within philanthropy, to try to democratize who is making decisions about where funding is going. But we also have some education work to do to really encourage funders, and that is on us as funders in this space to be doing. And we want to do that alongside activists and movement folks as much as they want to be participating in it. And I think that's why the trust-based philanthropy work here in this community of practice is really exciting, because it is really trying to bring together multiple voices and not just having it be in a funder exclusive space, but really educating funders that they can, if they're not ready to fund activism, that could be, they're afraid for the legal risks, like they can be funding convenings, they can be funding like alliance building, spaces for creative exploration, they can be funding media and storytelling, they can be funding mediation and therapy. There's like a million different ways to be funding parts of the ecosystem. And I think we really need to get that across to funders so that we can, you know, bring more resources in, because we really have to do that. And I know I'm talking too much, so I'm going to stop there, but thank you.
Thanks so much. We have a lot of homework to do. John, I'll invite you to share, and then unfortunately after that, we're going to need to close our time together, but hopefully we can keep the conversation going.
Well, I would just say I've written a lot of things into the chat because I didn't want to take up too much time. And we have a global network that started 5.5 years ago. It's grown to 55 camps in 6 continents that are doing ecosystem restoration. So we feel that there are physical needs, and we honor the indigenous people and their wisdom and hope to collaborate in every place. And all the camps are autonomous, self-organizing, and self-governing, and led by the local communities, including indigenous people in many countries, and many countries which are at high risk. And so we're very happy to collaborate with anyone who wants to. There's also a growing streaming service that can go out free to educators and schools and teachers. And there is a global Earth Repair Summit, which is coming up, and we're planning talking circles that are led by the indigenous people to describe for the people around the world what needs to be done. And we'll continue after the global Earth Repair Summit in streaming everywhere. So thank you so much to everybody for this, and please feel free to contact me.
Thank you. One last voice with a burning question or insight of how we can grow the funding and strengthen the movements and the protection and the well-being of our dear activists. go on.
Hello, I had a quick thought, which is I think some of the best, and sorry about the music in the background, some of the best, I'm Robin from Fossil Free London, and we take action against the fossil fuel industry in London. And I think like one of the best things that funders can do is make the process of application really simple, and make the like documents that you have to fill in quite quick to fill in, so we can spend more time on action and less on sort of crafting the exact words. And there's some funders that very helpfully sort of talk you through like their priorities and have a bit of a chat with you, so you can sort of co-create it to begin. So you know you get a bit of a sense of like how they want you to word things, and so you're not sort of stabbing in the dark. So I think, especially for like a new organization like ours, that's so vital. So yeah, just making the process of application simple and guided.
Perfect. Totally agree. We're on the community of practice. We're working hard on that to understand what's the least legal need on this select due diligence and agreements in order to just free time to do the real work. So I know we're on the time, but I'll ask you to stay another 2 minutes if you can, so Faith can give you our last notes. And thank you so much. It's been really rich conversation, and we hope we can meet again in other forums to keep this ball rolling.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo you, Renata. Thank you to Casey and Shannon, Farhana, Olga, Erica, and Christina. And yeah, there's so many other of you that are on the call that are activists and actually part of this movement that keeps things going towards the world that we are actually trying to build. So this is one of our webinars through the Humans of Regeneration series with Be the Earth and Regenerosity. We'll be hosting another webinar on December 8th on healing justice, building community resilience through trauma healing. So we're always looking for contributions. And again, I would love to just invite you to be a part of this funder community of practice. It takes all of us to build a village, so to speak. Yeah, and we will be sending out the chat. The chat was incredibly rich. We'll also be sending the Jamboard and this video to those of you who are not able to be on this call, as well as those of you who are on this call. And just wanted to say a deep bow of gratitude to all of you who have joined us as participants, all of you who continue to do this work. This is really the new, I guess this is the old way of giving, and it's really bringing this reinvigoration and re-enlivening of what trust is, and how do we actually fuel this next century moving forward. So thank you all. If I missed anything, James, I just wanted to say thank you for hosting. Renata, thank you for hosting. Ruth in the background, thank you for putting this together. And thank all of you. We look forward to seeing you guys on the 8th. Feel free to come off mute and say one word of gratitude. That's how we really like to end our webinar.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
you so much.
Thank you, Lush,
Good
for
luck.
inviting us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you.
Thank you, Casey.
Just wanted to say thank you to all the organising. It was a really brilliantly, calmly led process. And yeah, the chat and the connections are so powerful. And it's great that you've got the community of practice and these follow-ups as well. So yeah, that's so nice. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
That was wonderful. Thank you for including me and just getting to know all of you more too. I hope we get to stay connected and continue on with this changing and shifting philanthropy and getting more voices and more, buy-in on what needs to get done. And so, yeah, I hope that we continue all together.
it made me think of two things, that perhaps it would be great to have like a follow-up that's done as a workshop for funders,